a beverage, maybe a snack, and let's get into it. Well, again, welcome and thanks for tuning in this evening. I pray that you've had a wonderful day today. What a beautiful day here in Ohio, and wherever you may be joining in from tonight, or even if you're not tuning in live, maybe another time. I pray that your day's been well, that you've been able to enjoy this spring-like kind of weather that we've finally been getting here this week, and just pray that your day has been going well. And we are journeying through the Bible here a chapter at a time. It's been a joy to go with these different chapters with you, with different people from all across our online platforms and from around the country even. And we are in our 142nd study, which is just amazing. There are 1,186 chapters in the Bible. It seems daunting, seems overwhelming, but since we've started this study, we are more than 10% of the way done. And we're making great progress. So whether this is your first time or you've been with us from the very beginning, I welcome you and appreciate you taking time to journey through the Bible together as we learn with each other and from each other. Just to recap where we were at last night, we looked at Numbers chapter 24. Friday we looked at Numbers chapter 23, Monday chapter 24. Those two chapters go together in that they discuss Balaam's 7 oracles, these visions that God revealed to him about the blessings that were going to come to Israel and about the future of Israel, and that they were going to defeat many of their enemies. Tonight we are going to see Israel's final rebellion and the end of this older generation. Now, as human beings, aren't we often the most vulnerable to failure after we have experienced a great success? That tends to happen in life, where we come off of a great success, and then it's not soon after that we become vulnerable to a failure. A Major League Baseball player who hits a grand slam, high expectations their next time at bat, and if they strike out, it's just this kind of cycle from great success to failure. This chapter, Numbers 25, contains one of the great failures of Israel, and it's coming right on the heels of one of its greatest blessings in Numbers 23 and 24. And you can kind of compare that to the giving of the Mosaic law and the making of the golden calf. The Israelites were about to receive the 10 commandments. Instead, they fashioned a golden calf, an idol. The consecration of Aaron as high priest. And then shortly after that, the failure of 2 of his sons who were killed because they gave a unauthorized offering to God, an offering that was not pleasing to the Lord. So while God was preparing to bless his people were preparing to disobey him. And so now we come to the ultimate rebellion of the Israelites in the desert. This ends their 40-year wandering, or their 38-year wandering, their 40-year time period of the Exodus. This is the end of their desert experience as they prepare to enter into the promised land. And this place where they are at is the staging area for the conquest of the land of Canaan, for the promised land. The issue that they're running into is that they were blatantly disobeying the Lord, disobeying Yahweh, by participating in these Canaanite rituals, these sexually centered Canaanite religious rites of Baal worship, Baal, this idol Baal, which is going to become the bane of their existence and the bane of their experience in the promised land. This chapter is an end and it's a beginning. It marks the end of the first generation, the older generation who were told you will not enter the promised land, and it points to a new beginning of a whole new series of wicked acts by this new younger generation that's finally going to lead to punishment. And it's not by surprise that this chapter 25 is placed between the oracles of Balaam and 23 and 24, and the second census that we'll see tomorrow in chapter 26. Even while God was blessing Israel through Balaam in Numbers 23 and 24 on the heights of Peor, below them on the plains of Moab, Israel was once again demonstrating its weak and sinful character. And there's a very obvious parallel here between what we're going to see in this incident and what happened with the giving of the law and the golden calf back at the Sinai. The significant parallels between the golden calf and the Baal stories suggest that the old generation of Israelites have made little to no progress in their commitment to God's covenant. They're going to end up where they began, worshiping other gods and breaking the first and the most fundamental of the laws of the Ten Commandments from Exodus 20, verse 2, that you shall have no other gods before me. Now, there is a glimmer of hope here, and the one glimmer of hope in this Baal story is the priest Phinehas, who is the grandson of Aaron, the first high priest. And while Aaron had been a leader in leading the Israelites astray at Sinai and worshiping this golden calf, Phinehas is going to be a leader that upholds God's commands and prevents and stops the disobedience of God among the Israelites. So open up your Bibles to Numbers chapter 25 here, and we're going to start with verses 1 through 5. If you don't have a Bible with you, not a problem. I'll put the verses up here on the screen. You can follow along. It's not a big chapter, not a long chapter, but there's a lot to look at in here. So let's look at the first 5 verses, and we're going to start here with Moab's seduction of Israel. Now, Balak, if you remember, in Numbers 23 and 24, his plan to curse Israel through Balaam had failed. And so now these enemies of Israel are going to take another approach, and this one's going to prove to be successful. In Numbers chapters 22, 23, and 24, the Moabites kind of took the lead in overthrowing Israel, with the Midianites playing kind of a minor role in that. Here we see the flip side, in that the Midianites are going to take the lead in overthrowing the Israelites, with the Moabites supporting them. So let's get into it here. We'll start with verse 1. While Israel was staying in Shittim, the men began to indulge in sexual immorality with the Moabite women, who invited them to the sacrifices of their gods. And all the people ate the sacrificial meal, and they all bowed before these gods. The Moabite women seduced the Israelite men into idolatry. Balaam had counseled them to intermarry with the Israelites. And the Midian princess here was going to lead this plot. Now, we'll see how Balaam had a role in this when we get to Numbers 31, because we really haven't talked about that. But Balaam, who refused to curse the Israelites, he still plays a role here in getting the Israelites to succumb to this idol worship by intermarrying with the Moabite women, and it's going to cause a problem here for them. It was the assumption of the Baal cult that the fertility of the people and of the land, the crops, and the cattle, it all depended on a sexual linkage of a god and a goddess. And by imitating this union of the god and the goddess, the men and the women would seek to induce the gods here to grant a greater measure of fertility. And these kinds of cultic practices were common in all the nations that were surrounding the Israelites, including the Moabites that we are seeing here. And so Israel yoked themselves to the Baal of Peor. That's the name of the god that they're going to worship. And the Lord's anger burned against them. The Moabites primarily, and the Midianites in a minor role, they were partners in this spiritual and sexual seduction of the Israelites. And it's ironic because the Midianites were the people among whom Moses found refuge from Pharaoh. When he fled from Pharaoh, he went to the land of Midian. He took a Midianite to be his wife. And now the Midianites are becoming one of the instigators of Israel's perhaps their biggest major spiritual disobedience of God since the time that they left Sinai. And that was to engage in this practice of worshiping Baal of Peor. Now, the worship of Moab's gods involved this sacred kind of prostitution, as well as eating sacrifices that were offered to the dead. And when we get to Psalms, in Psalm 106, you'll see this. In Psalm 106, verses 28 through 31, where it says that they, the Israelite men, yoked themselves to the Baal of Peor, and they ate sacrifices offered to the lifeless gods, to the dead. Now, if you just picked up the Bible and you opened up to Psalm 106 and you read that, it probably wouldn't make a whole lot of sense. But now we see the psalmist writing about this incident that we are going to see here in Numbers 25. So the Lord's anger burned against the Israelites, and the Lord said to Moses, verse 4, "Take all of the leaders of these people and kill them, and expose them in broad daylight before the Lord," and we'll talk about what that means to expose them, "so that the Lord's fierce anger may turn away from Israel." This violation here, it strikes the very heart of the Mosaic covenant, which demanded total, exclusive allegiance to Yahweh. And it's going to result in a plague that would kill 24,000 Israelites, which we're going to see in a couple moments in verse 9. Now, what does it mean to expose them, to kill them and expose them in broad daylight? The Israelite leaders were to be killed, and their bodies were to be dismembered and displayed in the open in this kind of awful symbol of divine judgment. And so Moses, verse 5, said to the judges, "Each of you must put to death those of your people who have yoked themselves to the Baal of Peor." Now, to stop this plague, God had ordered the making of an atonement by sacrificing the leaders within Israel. Since the whole nation had sinned, God was going to punish the leaders, because the leaders stood for the people, and the leaders should have restrained the people. They should have restrained the disobedience of the people. And so the leaders were put to death. The judges, Israel's judges, in verse 5, were to carry out this order from the Lord. This sin is far worse than the sins that we saw in chapters 12, 13, and 14, any sin before. Here we see the ultimate sin, right? This marks the end of the road for the Israelites. So now we see in verses 6 through 15 that this situation is going to take a turn for the worse when a man named Zimri, who's one of the sons of a Simeonite leader. Simeon was one of the 12 tribes of Israel. Zimri was a son of one of the leaders of the Simeonites. He was going to bring a daughter of a Midianite leader named Cosbi into the camp. And up until now, all this sinning had taken place in the Moabite camps and in the Midianite camps. Now it's moving into the Israelite camp. So let's move to verse 6. Then an Israelite man brought into the camp a Midianite woman right before the eyes of Moses, right in his face, and in front of the whole assembly of Israel, while they were weeping at the entrance to the tent of meeting. It didn't take long. God imposed this judgment on the leaders. All these people were to be killed, their bodies dismembered. There's weeping, there's crying. And right in the face of that, this Israelite man brings a Midianite woman into the camp. And in joining together the sexual frenzies of the sacrificial feasts of Baal of Peor, this man, this Israelite man, and his priestess partner acted together to transform the worship of the Lord into the type of sexual rites that were taking place in Canaan. And it needs to be noted here that Moses here is seen as being remarkably ineffective in the face of this very blatant transgression. This Israelite man, this Midianite woman, they come right in front of Moses, right in front of the people. And Moses here does nothing to stop this. Totally ineffective. But the day we will see is saved by a decisive action of one of the next generation of the priests, who was Phinehas, the grandson of Aaron. So when Phinehas, son of Eleazar, son of Aaron, so Phinehas, his father was Eleazar, Phinehas' grandfather was Aaron. When Phinehas, who was a priest, saw this, because remember, the lineage of Aaron, all the sons were to be priests. So Phinehas is a priest. When he saw this, he left the assembly, the gathering of people, and he took a spear in his hand, and he followed this Israelite man and the woman that he was with, this Midianite woman, followed them into the inner room of the tent. And we'll talk about what the tent is. So evidently, Zimri, who was this Israelite man, could have cared less about the covenant or the tabernacle or Moses or the priests or God's judgment on the leaders of Israel, which just took place, or his father. Zimri had contempt. He could have cared less about any of this. So he took this priestess Midianite woman Cosbi into the tent, into the inner room of the tent. And there they engaged in sexual relations. And they did all this according to the customs of worship of the Baal of Peor. Now, the meaning of into the tent, or in some translations, into the inner room of the tent, it's a debated topic. A few different views. One is that Zimri took Cosbi into the holy place of the tabernacle. Another view is that he took her under a canopy at the entrance to the tabernacle. And then a third view is that he took her into his own tent. And that seems to be the most popular view among scholars, is that the tent here, that this sexual frenzy was taking place, was in Zimri's tent. And it's hard to determine exactly which tent for sure, because the Hebrew word here used, it's kobah. It means vaulted tent, and that's the only time that we see that particular word in the Old Testament. But from what we know, it designates that it was a bedchamber of Zimri where Phinehas caught these two people in this act. So he takes the spear in, follows them into this tent, and he drove the spear into both of them, right through the Israelite man and into the woman's stomach. The Hebrew word here literally means through their bellies. So Phinehas's act here was a divine judgment of capital punishment on Zimri and Cosby. It wasn't murder. This was judgment on their action and on their attitude. And so Phinehas slew them in the act of intercourse by driving his spear through both their bodies. And then the plague against the Israelites was stopped. But those who died prior to that incident of the spear of Phinehas, 24,000 died in this plague, this killing of the leaders. And so verse 10, the Lord said to Moses, Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, the son of Aaron, the priest, he has turned my anger away from the Israelites, since he was as zealous for my honor among them as I am. And because of that, I did not put an end to them all in my zeal. Therefore, tell him, I am making my covenant of peace with him. Now, the priests of Israel, much like today, priests and pastors and ministers represent God to the people and represent the people to God. And that's exactly what Phinehas did here. He did for the Israelites what Moses did not. He did for the Israelites what God required of his people. And so he executed these two people, Zimri and Cosby, who by their own actions and by their attitudes were repudiating the covenant. And because Phinehas acted this way, God's wrath turned away from the Israelites, and God was going to reward Phinehas by promising that his descendants would enjoy peace and would occupy the office of the high priest forever. Verse 13, he and his descendants, Phinehas and his descendants, will have a covenant of a lasting priesthood because he was zealous for the honor of his God and because he made the atonement for the Israelites. Phinehas, grandson of the high priest of Aaron, made atonement for the Israelites. And the name of the Israelite who was killed with the Midianite woman was Zimri. So here we see their names. The son of Salu, who was the leader of a Simeonite family. So Zimri was of the Simeonite clan leaders, so he was fairly high up. The name of the Midianite woman who was put to death was Cosby, daughter of Zur, who was a tribal leader of a Midianite family. So here we see kind of this priestess, these two people executed because of their contempt for the covenant. Now we see a woman priest here, or this priestess of Cosby. And while the priests in Israel were always men, in the pagan religions that surrounded Israel, priests could be women. And in fact, the sexually centered religions of Canaan would have catered to women in their priesthood. And women priests were so very closely tied to the sexual outrages of Baal worship that the very notion of a woman priest would conjure up images of sexual worship. So for the pagan nations around Israel, to be a female priest was not an abnormality. In fact, it was something that when you saw a woman priest, these sexual rites of worshiping Baal would come to mind. And perhaps this is the reason that Israel did not have any women priests, because they were to stand apart from the nations around them. So just a little sidebar, so to speak. And then finally, verses 16 through 18. The Lord said to Moses, treat the Midianites as your enemies and kill them. They treated you as enemies when they deceived you in the Peor incident involving their sister Cosby, the daughter of a Midianite tribe leader, the woman who was killed when the plague came as a result of that incident. As a result of the Midianite women's seduction of the Israelite men into idol worship and into its corresponding immorality, God commanded Moses to be hostile towards the Midianites from that point forward. Evidently, the Midianites were so steeped in idol worship that there was just no hope that they were ever going to change. There was always hope for the individual Midianite. There was hope for any pagan individual. Anyone could come to faith in Yahweh. And in fact, we see that with Ruth. But the nation as a whole, the Midianites, were beyond redemption. And they were to be treated as enemies by the Israelites going forward. So this incident, just as in the others in which Israel departed from God, shows the habitual sinfulness of humans even when God blesses them so greatly. It demonstrates the holiness of God and the seriousness of sin in the way that sin utterly destroys fellowship with God. And so there's a necessity of atonement in order to restore sinners to that relationship to God. Here we saw it with Phineas. For us as Christians, that atonement is done through what we just celebrated, the death and the resurrection of our Lord Jesus Christ. So that's Numbers 25. I appreciate you being here this evening. I hope that has been a help. Tomorrow we're going to look at Numbers 26. We're going to talk about the prospects of the younger generation, the next generation in the land. That'll take us through the end of the book of Numbers, but specifically tomorrow, we're going to look at the second census. So I invite you back again, but thank you for being here tonight. I do appreciate you being part of this study. Stay well, stay safe, stay healthy, and I look forward to seeing you soon. Until then, take care, and God bless. Bye-bye.